session. It's great to have so many in attendance, and we hope that you're all well and safe. My name is James Camerari, Vice President of North American Sales at COPC, and I will serve as today's session host. I'd like to start by introducing two of my colleagues and veteran COPC consultants that will be leading today's event. First, Cindy Edwards, Director of North American Consulting, who offers 25 years as a customer experience professional. Hi, Cindy. And has been with COPC for the last 15 years. And second, Scott Flewelling, who has been with COPC since 1999, is one of our most senior members of the team. He has led client engagements in over 15 countries and is our certification practice lead. Both Cindy and Scott bring many years of experience on the client, outsourced, and consultancy side of our industry, and are also responsible for leading performance improvement and vendor management consulting engagements for the delivery of many of our best practice training classes as well. And the three of us are glad to be here with you today. As some of you may already be familiar with COPC, I'll just take a quick moment to introduce our organization. And as our chairman, Cliff Moore, is quoted here, we are relentlessly focused on performance improvement for operations that support the customer experience. This is all we do. And to expand upon that a bit, we are a global consulting firm that's been around since the mid-90s. We developed a performance management system and quality management framework known as the COPC Customer Experience Standard, to which many high-performing organizations follow, are compliant with, or even become certified. In terms of our solutions, we provide customer experience strategy and optimization consulting, which again focuses on performance improvement. We also provide strategic sourcing strategy and consulting for vendor management organizations. Not to leave out our customer experience and best practices training and certification. Some of the most largest and most successful organizations use us to help guide them in driving performance. Okay, a couple of quick housekeeping items, just so everyone's aware. During the session, the attendees will be muted, but you'll be able to submit questions. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So feel free during our session to submit any questions you might have. And our 1 hour agenda will include about a 10 to 15 minute session after the presentation in which Scott and Cindy will field these questions. So again, feel free to submit as we go. All right, with that said, I'd like to hand it off to Cindy, I believe, to get us started. Cindy?
Great, yeah, thanks, James. Welcome to our webinar on driving performance with the COPC VMO standard. Today, Scott and I are going to share a little bit of background information so you understand how and when the VMO standard was developed. Then we're going to take you through an overview of the standard itself and share with you a few of the common issues with which VMOs struggle. So let's start with a bit of background information. The COPC experience standard came about in 1996 when this core group of customer contact center industry leaders got together. They talked about the services their customers were experiencing from the vendors to which these organizations had outsourced. And as you can see, these are names we all recognize. And their leaders were concerned about the level of service being provided to their customers. So after putting their heads together across many days, they landed on creating a standard that included the must-have elements they believed would drive higher levels of service, quality, and customer satisfaction. This team used the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award criteria as their foundation. The original team of companies then became members of the Standards Committee, which still exists today, although the members and companies have certainly changed over the years. The standard itself is in its 6th major release and has certainly been expanded over the years. It provides guidelines and best practices and implementation tips that help organizations manage their customer experience operation either through human-assisted channels like phones and emails and chats to digital-assisted channels like apps, websites, and kiosks. The Standards Committee is the controlling body of the standards. They meet twice per year and they discuss industry trends and they work to ensure the standards are relevant and updated as needed. They also define and approve the audit process that's implemented by those of us who work at COPC. And they arbitrate any disputes that may come up. I'm pretty happy to say that in my 14 years with COPC, I have not had to take any disputes to the Standards Committee, which really I believe is a testament to how thoughtful and thorough this member committee is when making changes. And because of their involvement, we at COPC, we don't get to actually write the standard, but we do conduct audits. We grant certification status to organizations who have fulfilled the requirements. We provide training to organizations to help them understand best practices and how to interpret the requirements for their business. And honestly, the majority of the work we do is providing our consulting services to help organizations improve key areas of their business. So let's look at the timeline of how the standard was developed. Although we're here to learn about the VMO standard, the Standards Committee and COPC first introduced the COPC CX standard for CSPs in 1996. This was designed specifically for customer service providers. In 2002, the Standards Committee, in conjunction with COPC, developed the COPC CX standard for VMOs, vendor management organizations. We kept hearing from the outsourced organizations that we worked with that they wished their clients knew more about how to deliver high performance to their customers. They had learned so much using the CSP standard, and they felt like they were constantly educating their client on why they do what they do to service the customers, following all the best practices. After a couple of years worth of work, the VMO standard was launched. And this provided the vendor management organization with a framework that helped them understand the processes needed to service their customers. In addition, they also learned how to select and contract with the right vendors and how to manage them. And the VMOs began to speak the same language with the CSPs, and they began to work together much better to support their customers. Then in 2011, the OSP standard was launched, really with the intent of adding a few items very specific to outsourced service providers and modifying some of the requirements to suit their specific challenges. There is a high degree of interrelationship between the standards, and in particular, the VMO and OSP standards are really designed to be used together. Some of the largest vendor manager organizations in the world utilize the VMO standard and require their vendors to become certified to the OSP standard. By doing this, it ensures a complete system for improving the customer experience, which I know we are all passionate about, given your attendance here today. So that's what's brought us to this point. Now let's review the VMO standard itself. Our mantra is that any organization should work hard to balance service, quality, and cost, and improve on all three in order to realize higher customer experience results and to be more profitable. So the VMO needs to be able to demonstrate that they can improve the service provided to customers, increase the quality of the interactions, and increase revenue. At the same time, they need to be thinking of ways to drive costs out of the business. If the VMO is successful at improving service and quality, customer experience will increase. When they're successful at increasing revenue and driving costs down, the organization will be more profitable. Sometimes we hear VMOs tell their clients, hey, if you want high levels of service and quality, it's going to cost you because we're going to need to hire more staff. That's just not true. We have many, many examples of where organizations have successfully balanced all of these metrics at the same time. So now we're going to take a deep dive into the VMO standard requirements and see how this mantra plays out. Although this appears to be a bit of an eye chart, let me break this down so you get a high-level understanding. As you can see, there are 4 categories. On the left, category 1 is leadership and planning. It contains 5 items that all have to do with setting the foundation for the organization. The statement of direction, building business plans that support the statement of direction, determining what the high performance benchmark targets need to be for our business, reviewing that performance and the business plan objectives, and finally, ensuring that we are sourcing responsibly. In the middle are categories 2 and 3. Category 2 is processes, category 3 are the key people processes, and we call both of these the enablers. Naturally, we need structured processes that have a high probability of meeting our expectations and requirements. And we need our key people to have the skills and the aptitude to carry out these processes successfully. Within category 2, you'll notice there are 25 items. 5 of them at the very top deal with establishing and closing client relationships and programs. These are very specific to VMOs, as they use these processes to define the requirements needed of OSPs and conducting the RFP process, figuring out who to select and contract with, and implementing those OSPs, and unfortunately, if needed, close a relationship with an OSP or a program. In the center of category 2, you will see where the VMO is responsible for managing customer touchpoints. And we have items 2.9 through 2.18. All these items are duplicated in the OSP standard. So although the OSP may own some of these processes, VMOs getting certified must ensure the approach is being followed. We find that this is really a bit of a mixed bag in terms of who owns what. For some of our clients, the VMO owns half of the workforce management process. Look at items 2.14 and 2.15. The VMO does all the forecasting and CAP planning. Then they provide this information to their OSPs, and then the OSPs do the scheduling and real-time management. For other clients, the VMO completely outsources the item. So if we look at item 2.12, quality management, the VMO may ask the OSPs to develop and deploy this process. In that case, the VMO getting certified is responsible for ensuring the OSP's approach meets the requirements laid out in this item 2.12. The last category is 4.0 performance, and you see this on the right. I call this where the rubber meets the road, because the VMO, together with their OSPs, needs to ensure these metrics are performing in a consistent manner. Back to our mantra. We really need to balance the service, quality, and cost to achieve high levels of customer experience. That's item 4.1. And to be profitable. That's item 4.4. As a VMO, do you want to achieve the best possible outcome? If so, form a marriage between the VMO standard and the OSP standard. Require your VMO to be certified so they know how to select the right outsourcers for their business and how to manage those OSPs to drive higher levels of performance. And require your OSPs to be certified so they are following the same structured best practice processes. You'll have a common language, and you're linked with the same goals of driving higher levels of performance. What better way to be a successful VMO? I really can't think of one. Now let's take a look at the key VMO relationships. This is a vendor management organization that typically resides within companies that outsource some or all their services. Those working within the VMO take direction from others within the enterprise who are responsible for sets of customers, and we call them the clients. A client may be responsible for a specific product. As an example, They work with marketing and others to project future volumes and needs for that product, and then communicate those needs to their contact in the VMO. The VMO is responsible for selecting and contracting with OSPs, or outsourced service providers, or vendors who work with the VMO's customers. Typically, the OSP introduces themselves as if they are the client supporting them. So most customers don't even know they're interacting with a third party. The VMO also interfaces with their key suppliers. And these key suppliers may be other departments, either within the company or enterprise, that are critical to the VMO's success. They may be workforce or training, they may be contracting or legal. And last but most important are the customers. The customer either contacts an agent at the OSP through a human-assisted channel, or they service themselves through a digital-assisted channel. The key takeaways are that the VMO needs to understand what their clients need and how to satisfy those needs through the use of OSPs. Naturally, finding the best fit OSP is really important to the VMO because the process by which to contract takes a lot of time and energy. And they want to ensure the OSP is successful so the VMO is able to meet their clients' needs. Now that we understand the VMO relationships, let's look at the functions of the VMO. As we said, the VMO is the interface between the requirements of clients and the execution of the processes. We know through the relationship that the VMO needs to ensure the client requirements are understood and they're included in the contract with the vendors or OSPs. Likewise, the VMO interfaces with the OSPs and any supplier experts to ensure their processes are aligned with meeting those business unit needs. And then the VMO is responsible for working with the support functions like workforce and training and quality, which we call shared services. If your VMO is set up differently, ask yourselves if you are successful in meeting your client needs and your OSP needs, and ultimately is the work you are doing translating into satisfied customers and a profitable business. If not, then you may want to consider this functional design. In the next slide, we're going to discuss the level of involvement in some of the key operational areas. After understanding our VMO client's organization structure, the next thing we do is review this chart to understand how involved they are with what happens in operations at their OSPs. For governance at the very top, we want to know how often you hold touch points with your OSPs. If you only meet annually with them, then we would say you have a low level of involvement. Versus if you have vendor account managers on site at your OSPs, we would then rate that as very high involvement. For customer experience, low involvement is if you have no requirements for your OSPs, while high involvement means you review every single verbatim that comes in and you review all the action plans established for the agents. We're going to talk more about service journeys, but if you are a VMO that has no service journey requirements, then we would rate you as low involvement. If you have already mapped out or blueprinted all of your customers' possible service journeys, then you would have high involvement. Your answers to these sets expectations within our minds as to who would be developing and deploying the processes in category 2 of the standard. For the last section of our agenda today, we want to discuss a few of the most common issues VMOs have. And these are the 5 that we've chosen for today. What if my vendor is not meeting contractual requirements? Why are costs higher than we planned? Are we using our information to improve the customer experience? How do we manage inconsistent performance from our vendors? Do our vendor managers have the right skills? We're going to start at the top of this list. And what if my vendor is not meeting contractual requirements? Well, some VMOs have difficulty determining why this might happen, and they ask themselves, did we define the requirements correctly in the contract? Did we select the right vendor? Did we push ourselves into a corner by not making the contract flexible enough? You may remember these items from category 2 of the standard. And this is where we would begin to look for answers to those questions. We would look in item 2.1, defining requirements, to see if we followed these recommendations. And we would review item 2.3, selecting and contracting OSPs, to see if we implemented all the best practices regarding flexible contracting. We find these are common mistakes made by VMOs when we're defining the requirements to be included in the RFP. Some organizations are just resistant to documenting requirements, or they have followed a find and replace approach when building the RFP, and this causes the requirements to be out of date, incomplete, or just wrong. We find VMOs document the requirements they think their clients or stakeholders need, but they don't really involve them or gather their input. And when they do include the stakeholders, they really aren't forthcoming with providing their requirements. On the flip side, is a VMO gets the requirements so specific, the OSP reviewing these requirements may think they have a way to meet them, but not necessarily the way that is documented. So they indicate in their response that they don't have this capability. Or the requirements are so vague that the OSPs can't figure out what is meant or actually needed. This then may turn into a question sent from the OSP to the VMO asking for clarification, when this back and forth could have been avoided. Really, the best practice is to ensure the requirements are complete, easy to understand, and the approach used to accomplish this is well-defined and documented so that all the VMO staff are able to follow it the same way. Some organizations create a client requirements template, and they use this to gather all the requirements from their client or stakeholder. That really helps ensure that the requirements are then transferred from that document into the RFP. It all comes down to intelligent, genuine effort on the front end results in less unplanned time and money spent on the back end. Once the RFP has been issued and responses have been received, then we find these mistakes made when working through the selection and contracting process. As the OSP responses are sent in, these should be entered into a tool that offers the reviewers the ability to rank the responses for each of the requirements. And the ranking produces a score for each OSP. This gives the VMO the ability to then objectively assess each OSP and reduces peer pressure and perhaps favoritism. We find some VMOs include the pricing in the initial selection process, and we highly recommend that this information is not shared until the team has done their initial review and down select, so as not to bias their opinion of one OSP versus another. And we find that the contracting process and the contracts themselves are inflexible and sometimes takes an act of Congress to make changes to keep up with the business needs. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Once you've done the down select, you're then ready to head out to conduct the site assessments. And we've found that these sometimes lack structure, and VMOs aren't sending folks who are knowledgeable about the requirements or how to even conduct a site assessment. Building a structured agenda, establishing a team lead, and ensuring the team understands their role will certainly produce a much better objective and detailed findings document. The next slide, let's look at the difference between two site assessment approaches. If the VMO left this up to the prospective OSP, the OSP may take the approach on the left-hand side. They would set the agenda. They would add in tons of time for socialization, perhaps even host an evening cocktail hour to show off their accomplishments, respond with general statements during the site assessment interviews that include a lot of, hey, we will wording versus what we do. The prospective OSP would ensure they have staff probably attached to your hip the whole time you're there and would limit discussions regarding findings. They would certainly ensure you are in and out in less than a day and have tons of opinions to justify performance levels. Naturally, what you want is what's illustrated on the right-hand side. Structuring the site assessments in this way helps ensure the team gets what they need before heading out to the next site. So now I'm going to show you a quick example of contract inflexibility and how it can be more flexible. Some VMOs have all the contractual requirements buried in the master service agreement and or in the SAL with many different addendums, and that list grows the longer the contract. This then requires the organization to get legal involved when changes need to be made. So for example, let's say the entire quality management approach and requirements are in the SAL, and the VMO has decided they want the OSPs to ensure they are monitoring each agent at least 5 times per month, instead of 3 times per month. This very small change may require the VMO to get legal involved to make and approve the change to the SAL. Whereas if the VMO includes the high-level requirements in the SAL, they can then put all the how-to requirement details in a document called an operating guideline. The operating guideline would complement the SAL, and where changes can be made by the VMO and communicated out to the OSPs without the need for legal. The MSA and SAL would reference frequent and ongoing changes to the operating guidelines. This allows you, the VMO, to be more flexible for your clients and stakeholders when they need changes made to support their business. Now I'm going to turn over the next couple of common issues to Scott.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Cindy. So the next topic that we want to discuss is costs. So the query may be from the VMO, why are costs higher than we actually planned? And really there's kind of 2 key issues that we tend to look at COPC with our VMOs. Do we have the right payment model in place for what we're actually outsourcing? And then is the vendor actually looking to reduce my costs? And that may not always be in their best interest, depending upon how they're paid. So when we think about pricing models, we tend to come across 4 pricing models, and certainly there are others that may be in place. The first is price per FTE, full-time equivalent. So the buyer, the VMO, is purchasing a fixed number of staff for set hours. Now, the positive of this is that you have a fixed cost, and you know what that is, and you will not exceed that on your budget as a VMO. The downside is there's actually no incentive for the vendor or the OSP to become more efficient with your resources because they're going to be paid one way or the other. Also, you can really suffer for service level performance. It can be quite inconsistent based upon volume changes. If volume increases and you don't have enough staff or they're not very efficient, then service level will of course suffer, and there'll be no putting extra people in place because of the fixed cost nature of the arrangement. The second model we see, which is probably a little bit more common, is price per handle minute, or could actually be translated into price per call. But in this, you pay per handle minute, usually up to a maximum average. The advantage of this is that you often get lower rates for higher volumes. As volume increases, then the OSPs or the vendors will provide a lower price per minute because they're able to cover off on their fixed costs. There's not necessarily any incentive for them to be efficient, and no incentive for them to actually reduce duplicate calls. And in some cases, we may say them actually encouraging duplicate calls because they'll get paid for those minutes. The third model we see is price per production hour. So the buyer, the VMO, is paying for talk time, hold time, wrap time in a call center environment, as well as available time. This is really good for the vendor because it eliminates the negative impact that they may have from low occupancy if volume doesn't materialize. The downside for the VMO is that they're going to pay for incorrect forecasts, and the vendor is actually incented to overstaff. The fourth model, however, which might be used in combination with other models, is risk and reward. So a bonus is actually achieved for performance beyond what is specified in the agreement. The bonus could be on many different metrics, such as issue resolution, customer satisfaction, service level performance. We want to make sure that the objectives, and the benefit of this is that if the objectives are aligned between the VMO and the vendor, then payment tied to results can be good for both parties, and it will really encourage the right behavior. The downside is you need to carefully balance what you're incenting, or you can drive results that are not actually what you intended to incur. The next way that we think about cost from a COPC perspective is really we can achieve cost savings by two different ways. The first is through labor efficiency, and the other is through cost cutting overall. So if we think about labor efficiency, there's some key things that we'd recommend any VMO takes a look at. The first is staffing ratios. Whether this is built into the agreement or the vendor is actually doing this on their own, ultimately as the VMO, you're paying for staffing ratios. So you want to take a look at what is the team leader to agent ratio. You don't want it to be too high, you don't want it to be too low, but also for other functions such as quality analysts that are actually monitoring the transactions, or trainers. Those types of other support functions are going to affect the cost and the efficiency and the labor. The second is CSS utilization. I don't think we've mentioned the term CSS yet, but that stands for Customer Support Specialist, what you may call an agent or a rep or a tech, or even if it's in a back office environment, someone who's processing those transactions. And certainly we want to make sure that people are utilized effectively for the time that they're paid. If they're not highly utilized, then that actually incorporates, of course, waste. So we want to make sure that people are getting appropriate coaching and training, that they're going to breaks and meetings. However, on the other hand, we want to control that so it doesn't become too excessive. Then the third thing to think about under labor efficiency is, once we have the staffing ratios right, once we have people highly utilized, is how do we actually reduce the transaction handle time? Now, we're never going to get the transaction to handle time down to nothing, but we do want to take a look at things such as what's the variation within the handle time from agent to agent or CSS to CSS. Are there opportunities to improve the process by reducing unnecessary steps so that we can reduce the handle time? And of the time, if we accomplish that, of course, of the time that people are utilized, they'll be able to handle more transactions in that amount of time. Then the second way to take a look at things is from a cost-cutting perspective. As a VMO, one of the considerations should be, should we consolidate vendors? As we talked about in the pricing models, we may actually get lower price per minute if we have higher volume. And you may actually want to take a look at, do we have too many vendors that we're distributing the volume out to? If we consolidate it, would we get a better price? The second topic under cost cutting is work at home. Now, certainly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this has become really in place for a lot of organizations that may not have ever considered it before. And I think now that organizations have experienced it, they're really asking themselves, should we continue in a work at home environment? There's a lot of advantages in a work at home environment relative to not having to, pay for a building and all of the rent and the fixed costs that go along with that. And I think that as organizations have been challenged through the last few months, they've found that there are different ways to do things that I think will actually change how we look at that on an ongoing basis. But the most important way to reduce cost is by eliminating transactions entirely. And this is a bit of a call center example, but I often say the best call is the one that never happened. And we need to really investigate, why are the calls occurring? Some calls are certainly going to be necessary, but Cindy had talked earlier that we have digital assisted channels, which we normally think of self-serve, like a website or an IVR or an app. And then we have human assisted transactions, which would be calls and chats and emails, back office transactions, storefront transactions. So we really should be trying to understand, how can we eliminate that volume, which we'll talk about more in the next topic. So the next topic is, are we actually using our information that we already have at our disposal to improve the customer experience? So as VMOs really get interested in understanding, what is the customer's path to resolution? And are they having to go through many steps to make that happen? They may actually struggle where the responsibility lies. So the first part of this is, do we know what the customer's resolution path actually is? And what steps did they take before they actually reached us? And then, of the data that we have, are we actually getting this data analyzed? So at COPC, Cindy had mentioned earlier when we talked about the level of involvement table, the service journey. And a service journey is the path that's taken by a customer interacting with any combination of support channels and resources end to end required to resolve a customer need. That may start with a customer actually going to a website, not finding the answer, perhaps going to some form of a knowledge base or a social media channel, not being satisfied through that, perhaps ending up in a phone call, and maybe that doesn't resolve the issue entirely, that then turns into a chat transaction or perhaps a callback. So the emphasis on this is on the operational part of the customer journey, focusing on the time period from the customer's first interaction with your company until the issue is resolved. And often in our business, we think about it in the transaction. What happened in that transaction, without considering what is the entire journey that the customer had to go through, which is their perspective. Again, thinking about what I talked about earlier, how do we eliminate transactions? The best call or the best email or the best chat is the one that never happened. If we do that, we will have reduced effort for the customers. It will improve their level of satisfaction, because believe it or not, they probably don't want to contact us in the first place, which will actually drive increased loyalty. So how do we find out what the customers want and what their journey is? We actually have a lot of this data at our disposal. Unfortunately, we find in our practice, consulting practice, that it's not well mined. We have frontline feedback. We can ask reps, why do people call us? Are there things that we could be doing differently? And they'll probably tell you, yes, if that option was fixed on the website, or if the documentation that went out with the product was actually clearer, we could actually eliminate those calls. We can look at our reasons for contact analysis from our CRM database. We can look at churn and loss reasons. Why do people leave us? What are people saying about us on social media? How do we analyze the surveys that we get back, our customer satisfaction surveys, our net promoter surveys? When we monitor transactions, are we monitoring to find out, did the agent give the right answer, which is certainly important, but are we also monitoring to find out, is the customer telling us, this is the 4th time I've called, or I'm calling because the information was not clear on the website? And often our QA process does not actually think that way. And if we do, then we can start to understand, how could we eliminate things upstream to eliminate the transaction from happening? Complaint analysis, and certainly verbatim reviews. We call all of this business intelligence. And as the VMO, we can take this information, if we mine it effectively, to identify for our client within our client organization, what are product or service issues that need to be addressed? What are policies that are irritants? Do we have defects in our website or other self-help or online channels? Are there processes that are broken, that people aren't getting callbacks? Are customers being given unclear or inaccurate documentation? So really, we need to take action on this customer information. And as Cindy talked about earlier with the level of involvement, this is really a shared responsibility. Some VMOs take more responsibility for it, others take put more on the vendors. But as a VMO, I would strongly encourage you to work with your vendors. Yes, they may actually not be encouraged to reduce transactions because they'll view that as potentially a revenue hit on their side. But I think as a partnership, you should really look to that and ask them to be mining in that data with you as a VMO so that you can improve the service journey and the customer experience ultimately. So the next topic we want to talk about is inconsistent performance from the vendors. And this is certainly a struggle for many VMOs. And Cindy talked about, did we pick the right vendor? Do we have the right requirements in the contract? I want to go into a little more depth on some of the common issues. Do I have the correct metrics in my contract? Are we inspecting what we actually expect? And is there root cause analysis that's actually occurring? So fortunately, the standard, and Cindy talked about category 4, which was on the right side of the slide earlier, has a performance section. And the standard guides us on the metrics that should be in place for those processes that are critical to the customer and the VMO. So this is an example from a client of the metrics that they put in place as part of their requirements. Now, honestly, you can't read it, so let's just blow up one of them and give you a little bit of an idea of the depth that occurs. So the first metric that they had on their list was schedule attainment. They were in a shared queue environment, so the VMO managed service level overall, and they wanted each of the vendors to put the appropriate number of people in place at the right time, which is down to the interval level to ensure that they hit service level overall. So schedule attainment was the actual number of agents at a 30-minute interval compared to the requirements that were produced by the VMO. Now, you're never going to staff exactly as a vendor, so the requirement was that you need to have between 95 and 120% of the required number of agents. So if you had asked for 100 agents and you provided 97 or 112, we call that success because it's in that sweet spot. And then we look at the number of intervals at the weekly level to determine, are we actually getting most of our intervals? In this case, it was 80% of our intervals within that required band of 95 and 120%. And if we did that, we'd call it success for the vendor, which is a lot better than saying, I want you to hit the number of FTE at the end of the week, and vendors may not necessarily staff appropriately to the arrival patterns that we want. So the next area is, are we inspecting what we expect? So certainly I would appreciate that as a VMO, you would have a business review process. You may have weekly business reviews, monthly business reviews, semi-annual, annual business reviews. You may even have daily business reviews with your vendors. So the business review process should be looking at what are the targets and the plans and what is the actual performance, of course. But the part where in the blue in the arrow is why are there gaps? And this is where we find that there's some opportunities. So this is an example from one of our clients, and the actual requirement for the vendors was that they hit service level at the end of the month. However, when we looked at the data over the course of 4 months, and we looked at it down to the day of the week, we found that there was very inconsistent performance depending upon the day of the week. So the VMO organization wanted to have a service level between 75 and 85% at the daily level. Too high is not cost effective. Too low is actually a poor customer experience. As we can see in this particular chart, it was highly inconsistent based upon the day of the week. We just happen to highlight the Saturdays to show that some Saturdays were really high and some were really poor. And we'll get into why this occurred in a couple of minutes. So what you want to do is effectively use all of the data that's available to improve the performance through the use of a structured problem-solving approach. I'm sure that many of you have heard of DeMAC before, which is part of the Six Sigma tool set, which stands for define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. And within DeMAC, there's a number of different techniques that we could be using from the Six Sigma tools as part of really the define, measure, and analyze phases. run charts, histograms, a COPC term, which is called variance significance factor, which looks at how much variation there is in a process. You could use more complex ways of looking at variation, such as process sigma. We want to understand a project charter, Pareto charts, process flows, infinity diagrams, voices, and the CTX tree, where X could be cost or the customer or the business. Scatter plots, regression analysis are just some examples of ways that we would analyze data to get down to the root cause. And I will say, unfortunately, we often find that vendor management organizations and the vendors do not do an effective job of digging down into the root causes to solve these problems of inconsistent performance. So let's go back to our previous example where the service level was highly variable based upon the day of the week. And what we actually looked at is the staffing that the vendor was putting in place 2 weeks in advance to the requirements. So this is not what actually happened. This is what they were planning to do. And we looked at this down to the interval level. So if we look at the top lines, they are planning to significantly overstaff. This is the number of agents that were above the line. And honestly, we were looking at time periods where they were having 150 or 200 more agents than were actually required to be put in place. This is going to lead to very, very high service levels that's not necessarily valued by the end customer and is certainly very costly. Conversely, they had intervals where they were actually planning to be negative 100 or negative 150 people. And this understaffing is going to cause 0% service level in those intervals. And of course, a very poor customer experience. Customers are going to be frustrated with the wait times, potentially abandon, and then recall at other intervals, which actually affects the arrival patterns. So the problem on why the service level was inconsistent by day of week actually started with the staffing was not very good, and the VMO was not looking at the vendor's staffing because they assumed that they were the experts that they had outsourced to, that they would be staffing appropriately. The vendor, on the other hand, was staffing people basically when they wanted to work, knowing that they will be paid anyway. Now I'll turn it back to Cindy for the last topic.
All righty, thanks, Scott. So the last topic is, do our vendor managers have the right skills? And most times we find VMOs assume those they have hired into this role will know what to do and be able to drive high performance with their OSPs. But that's not always the case, as you just heard from Scott. So we ask ourselves, did we select the right people for this role? Did we provide them the training they needed to ensure they have a high probability of being successful? So one of the first things we do is essentially look at category 3 in the VMO standard, where we need to have structured approaches for recruiting and hiring staff into VMO roles. We then need to provide them the training that sets expectations for what needs to be done in their role. And along with training, we need to verify that they learned what was necessary to be successful. And whether we're talking about OSP staff skills like agents or VMO staff skills such as vendor account managers, the workforce needs to be skilled and motivated. Skilled means they have the ability to carry out the processes needed to meet the expectations for their role and be successful. Motivated means they want to work for your company and make this their career, so they're more likely to stay for the long term. This is an example of a vendor manager minimum skills matrix, or what we commonly refer to it as a people matrix. The left-hand column lists all the skills needed for this role. And then we decide which of these are needed at the time of hire or once they've completed training. We don't expect people that we're hiring off the street to be knowledgeable of our products and processes, so we need to give them those skills through training and then verify their skills. We would take this one step further and add in the threshold levels needed to actually pass each of these skills. The key takeaway for this is to ensure your VMO staff have the skills to be successful, because they're responsible for working with your OSPs to ensure they are meeting their contractual requirements in servicing the client's customers. Because of this, we find many vendor account managers attend the training we provide to the OSPs, so they have a more thorough understanding to support the OSPs that work for the VMO. We have one last slide, and then we're going to take your questions. And this is, we work with clients in various ways to assist them in realizing their goals. Here are some of the ways that we can actually work with you to bring these best practices to life in your organization. We work with VMOs to implement best practices in their sourcing and contracting process. We help identify the requirements. We help create and issue the RFP. We help evaluate the results and then guide them in the selection of their vendors. We provide customer experience training for VMOs where we train your staff on the requirements within the VMO standard, and they learn all about the best practices and high performance benchmarks. We also conduct benchmark reviews where we advise how your processes compare to best practices and provide you detailed recommendations to ensure your program is designed to deliver expected results. And we work, hold please. And we work with your organizations to, we work with your organizations from a certification approach. And as I mentioned, the VMOs who marry these standards together with the OSP get a huge return on their investment. For anyone who's a hockey fan out there, we would say this is the hat trick. It's VMO certification, OSP certification, which yields benchmark levels for customer experience and profitability. So now, before I can make any more technical errors in the presentation, I'm going to turn it back over to James, see what questions he has for us.
Great. Well done, guys. Thank you so much for all the great information. As mentioned earlier, we've got about 8 minutes or so for some questions and answers. We've had a few come in. And really, it's great, Cindy, that you guys ended talking a little bit about certification, because one of the questions we got was, for companies with a huge ratio of outsourcing, do you recommend certification on CSP standard or VMO standard? Now, you just talked about the VMO and OSP standards, but this person's asking about whether for an organization that does quite a bit of outsourcing, what would we recommend?
Sure. Cindy, you want to take that or me?
No, go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so I think really we treat this, as Cindy said, it's a complete system. And so the VMO standard on its own is great, but it won't actually achieve all of your results without ensuring that your OSPs are actually following the same practices. And conversely, if an organization only required OSP certification, but they didn't actually understand all of the requirements of the VMO standard and hopefully get VMO certified, it's also not going to work. So I think it's the combination of all of that. So the long answer to that short question is that really, I think you would go through this as a system together. VMOs would go through the VMO training and achieve certification to the VMO standard. And then the OSPs would go through the training relative to that standard and understand how they would get certified. Some of our VMOs actually send people not to the VMO training, well, they'll send them to the VMO training, but they'll also send them to the training that their vendors would attend so that they understand all of the vendor requirements at the same time.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Another question here is, you had a slide which dealt with the level of involvement. Is it common for a VMO to be at the same level of involvement for all the areas you listed?
I'll take that one, Scott. I would say that we do see some variation, certainly depending on the item and depending on the VMO. I would say that some of the VMOs are just more involved than others. And if we find a high level of involvement on one item, we might find a high level of involvement on other items. And the opposite is also true. A lot of VMOs outsource because they don't know how to do something and they need the expertise of these OSPs. And so they rely on them to be the experts, as Scott indicated earlier in the presentation. So, so it's not uncommon to see the VMOs somewhat back off and let the OSPs do what they do best.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. I think we have time for one or two more. The next question is, how long does it take for COPC to review an existing agreement and modify to create the flexibility you mentioned through the operating guidelines?
Go ahead, Sid. Go ahead.
We'll fight for it.
That's a tough question, so that's a good one.
Yeah, I would say it's a really good question, though, but there is no one answer for that. We would need to review the contract with recommendations for change, and it's generally not too long to do that, maybe a week or two. And then in terms of the operating guidelines, it depends on who's going to take the lead on writing those. But if we decide that some clients want to write them themselves, that's fine, and we would review, or vice versa, right? So, so that could, in and of itself, could take a couple of months because we would need to do the due diligence to understand their business well enough to document those.
Great. Okay, we've got 3 minutes. Let's see if we can get one more quick one in, and then we'll take a quick poll. Let's see if I can give you one that won't take too long. We have monthly business reviews with vendors. However, the performance still seems to suffer, and the action plans they present don't seem to work. Thoughts?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is an all too common problem, and I think that there's a few things in place. I had the slide up about the DeMAC, and this is going to come across as a bit of a sales pitch, but we certainly, as COPC, offer training in Six Sigma techniques. We offer training for vendor managers on how they can become more skilled. And I don't think it's because people don't want to drive good performance; they just are not well equipped to do that. And so I want to ensure that our vendors are trained so they know how to do the analysis. It is a shared responsibility to do that. Also, I want to make sure that our vendor account managers are doing that. And I think the third part of that is that there's a conversation between the two, so that the vendor managers are asking the right questions to get to the root causes, and that they're encouraging the vendors to bring those forward.